The night Seraphine Vale walked barefoot across the frost-veined marble of the Stag Courts Cathedral to be ritually unchosen. The braziers were burning low, and the antler chandeliers overhead were creaking like old bones in a slow wind. And every noble in the long gallery had leaned forward in the hush reserved for executions and weddings, which, in this court, were nearly the same thing. She had been told how it would go. She had been told by the handmaiden Blanche, who had combed out her hair with trembling fingers that morning, and by the steward Vince, who had not met her eyes once since she arrived, and by the archivist in the black stole, who had slipped into her cell 2 evenings ago to press a vial of numbing draught into her palm and whisper that it would be kinder if she did not remember. Seraphine had not drunk the draught. She had walked into the Frost Cathedral remembering everything. She remembered the name of her village, which was Orwell's Hollow, and the name of the river that ran past it, which was the Thin Stream, and the name of the cartographer who had fathered her and died before teaching her to read anything but the hand-drawn lines he left behind. She remembered most of all the 4 nights she had spent in the dust-choked archive under the chapel, where the lanterns guttered blue from the cold and the vellum smelled of old iron, and she had found the claws. She could feel it now, tucked against her sternum, humming beneath her ribs like a second heart. What the court did not know, what they could not have known, was that the sentences on that parchment had moved under her gaze as though they were alive, as though they had been waiting 300 years for someone who could hear them. And when Alpha King Roarenstrike, last stag-crowned ruler of the antlered line, stepped from the dais in his gray furs and his bone diadem and lifted his voice to pronounce the severance that would send her into the convent of forgotten brides to join the 7 women before her, Seraphine stood very still and watched his mouth. His face was carved out of winter. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake where something deep still moved. He said the first of the ritual words without looking at her, and the second words looking at the stone between her feet, and only at the third words did he glance up, and in the brief collision of their gazes she felt something she had no vocabulary for. A low pull under her breastbone that was neither fear nor longing nor obedience. A hum like a plucked thread tied between them without their consent, and she understood with a clarity that frightened her that he felt it too, and was speaking the severance faster now, almost cruelly fast, to outrun it. "I do not want you, Seraphine Vale," he said, and a gasp like a small tide moved through the gallery, and the Lady Alicia at the foot of the dais pressed a gloved hand to her collarbone in a studied, beautiful grief that fooled no one but was applauded by everyone. "I sever the treaty bond offered by your tribute," he said, "and I release you to the quiet house," and the bone diadem caught the torchlight and threw it back as 9 small moons across the ceiling. She was supposed to kneel. She was supposed to weep. She was supposed to vanish as the others had vanished. Instead, Seraphine Vale lifted her chin and laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a raw, astonished, unspooling thing that rolled out of her chest and bounced off the antler chandeliers and startled a pair of nesting sparrows out of the high clerestory and sent them flapping into the rafters. The court went so silent she could hear the sparrows' wings. Roarenstrike's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the groomed edge of his beard. His nostrils flared, and in that small, involuntary motion, Seraphine saw the stag in him lift its head, aware. Blanche, pressed against the wall in the servants' aisle, had gone the color of whey. Vince had dropped his ceremonial staff. Lady Alicia's grief had slipped off her face like a badly pinned veil, and what was beneath it was not kind. The archivist in the black stole, the woman who had pressed the draft into Seraphine's hand, the woman Seraphine had learned 3 nights ago was her own mother, went very still against a pillar with her fingers pressed to her mouth, and her eyes, identical to Seraphine's own, were not proud. They were terrified. Good, Seraphine thought. She had come here to be terrifying. She drew breath. The laugh was still shaking in the cup of her throat, but she swallowed it down and found her voice, and it was steadier than she deserved. By the Second Concordat of the Antlered Throne, she said, in the old ceremonial cadence she had memorized by candlelight 4 nights in a row, and the words cut the air like struck crystal, and even the sparrows went quiet. By the clause appended under the seal of Queen Mother Edessa in the 9th winter of her reign, a treaty bride refused at the altar by the reigning alpha king of this court does not return to her village of origin, does not enter the convent of forgotten brides, and does not relinquish her tribute. She inherits it. Every advisor on the tiered benches moved at once, a ripple of robes and silver chains, and the whisper that went through them was not rumor, but recognition. The sound men make when they have forgotten something and been reminded of it by the wrong person. Seraphine did not stop. The refused bride, she said, inherits in her own name the borderlands listed in the tribute manifest, because the manifest is a contract of offered property, and property that is not accepted by the party to whom it is offered reverts not to the giver, but to the stated vessel of transfer. She took 1 step toward the dais. The frost under her feet hummed against her soles. That vessel, she said, is me. She watched Roran's face. The stag-crowned king's mouth had parted slightly. He was not angry. He was not even surprised in the way the council was surprised. He was looking at her as though a map he had been handed upside down had suddenly been righted. The borderlands in question, she continued, because she did not dare stop, because if she stopped, the council would start, are the 3 valleys west of the thin stream, the cartographer's passes, the silver vein calls, and the long meadow at Orwell's Hollow. They were offered as my bride price. You have refused the bride. By Edessa's clause, they are now mine. The Lady Alicia made a sound like a caught breath, and the counselor at her elbow, an elegant man in dove gray whose name Seraphine had not yet learned, but whose face she would come to know too well, laid a ringed hand on Alicia's wrist in a gesture that was meant to look soothing and was not. The head of the council, a broad-shouldered elder called Lord Corvain, rose to his feet with the ponderous grace of a man unaccustomed to being surprised in his own house. "Child," he said, not unkindly, "you have been reading books that are not meant for your hands." His voice did not carry anger, only the weary correction one offers a servant who has misunderstood a chore. The Second Concordat was retired under the winter accords. The clause you cite is dead law. Seraphine met his gaze and did not blink. The winter accords, she said, retired the Third Concordat. The second was never repealed. The archive has the scroll. The scroll has the seal. The seal has not been broken. I would be happy to walk the council to the shelf and show them. Somewhere in the gallery, a young page laughed, cut it off, and pretended to cough. Roran Strike had not moved. He was still watching her, and the lake behind his eyes had cracked somewhere deep, and something ancient was rising toward the surface. Lord Corvain's smile did not reach his mouth. "The clause," he said, "if it exists, applies to brides of acknowledged citizenship. You are a tribute from a border village, and tribute is a provisional status. It does not grant you standing to cite concordats." He spread his hands. "Your laugh was charming, girl. Kneel now, and the convent will be gentle with you." The convent had not been gentle with any of the 7. Seraphine felt the pull in her sternum tighten, as though a thread had been drawn taut between her chest and the king's, and she did not look at Roran because she could not afford to. But she knew by the sudden stillness of his shoulders that he felt it as she did. "My citizenship," she said, "is recorded in the tribute papers you required me to sign on entry to this court. Signed, sealed, witnessed. You cannot retract what you required." Corvain's smile thinned. "The papers can be reviewed," he said. "Tonight, in fact. The council will adjourn to consider your claim." The frost under her feet went cold in a way it had not been cold before. She knew, with the small dark certainty of a woman who has read too many buried clauses, that she had just been given until dawn to live. They took her to a guest chamber rather than a cell, which was its own cruelty, because guest chambers in the Stag Court had doors that locked from the outside, but were papered in such exquisite blue damask that a woman could convince herself she had not been imprisoned. Blanche was permitted to bring her tea. The tea went cold. A small fire muttered in the grate. Beyond the single narrow window, the court garden stretched away in pale geometries, and somewhere past the yew maze, Seraphine could hear the rutting bell of a distant stag, and she thought, absurdly, that even the animals of this kingdom announced themselves in iambs. Blanche sat on a low stool and did not pretend to pour more tea. "My lady," she whispered, "you should not have laughed." "I know," Seraphine said. "You should not have read those books. I know." Blanche's eyes were wet. "My lady, there is a woman who asks to see you. She says she is permitted. She says she is the archivist." "Send her in," Seraphine said, and the word archivist tasted like a coin in her mouth, bright and bitter. The archivist entered as though she had come to appraise a cracked face. She was a tall, thin woman in her 50s, with Seraphine's own mouth and Seraphine's own cheekbones and eyes that had seen too many burnings to cry at this one. She waited until Blanche had been sent to fetch fresh coals. She closed the door. She did not sit. "I am Nia," she said, as if Seraphine had not already known, as if saying it aloud made the claim smaller. "I signed your tribute papers," she said. "I signed you into this court because the alternative was watching the strike riders burn Orwell's Hollow to ash by the next frost. I arranged for you to be unchosen because the bond between you and that man, which you now feel and which he felt the moment you crossed the threshold, would have woken your gift too fast, before you could control it, before you could hide it. I wanted you to live in the convent. The convent would have been silent, and silence would have kept you breathing." Seraphine stared at her. "What gift?" she said. Naya's face did what faces do when they finally give up on a long secret. "Cartomancy," she said. "Your father's line was clean, but my line, the veil line, reads written law the way his court reads scent. The letters show us truth. The letters show us forgery. The letters show us the hand behind the signature. You read that clause, Seraphine, but more than that, the clause read you back. That is why it moved for you, and not for Corvain's scribes, who have been reading it for years and never saw it. It recognized you." Seraphine sat down slowly on the edge of the bed because her knees had decided for her. "How long?" she said. "How long have you known?" "Since the day you were born," Nia said, "and I have spent every year since trying to keep you unread." Seraphine laughed again, though softer this time, almost gentle. "Mother," she said, and watched Nia flinch at the word. "Mother, I am going to be killed before dawn." Nia's mouth tightened. "Not before dawn," she said. "At dawn. They will come at first light with an instrument called the clarion, and they will declare your citizenship retroactively annulled. It is an old mechanism. A village registered after a certain date by a certain clerk under a certain seal can be declared provisional and its tribute rendered nameless. Your tribute papers will be reread, and the clerk who registered Orwell's Hollow will be conveniently found to have been unauthorized, and you will be, as of an hour before you arrived in this court, no one." Seraphine's hands were very cold. "They can do that," she said. "They have done it," Nia said. 7 times. "The 7 before me," Seraphine said. Nia did not answer, which was an answer. "And then," Seraphine said, "then, without citizenship, you cannot hold land. Without land, you have no claim. Without claim, they quietly remove you, usually on the road, usually by bandits that the council has never, in 300 years, managed to catch." There was a long silence between them. The fire muttered. Somewhere in the corridor, a servant passed with a tray and did not stop. Seraphine lifted her head. "Then I invoke the second right," she said. Nia's face went white. "No," she said. "Yes," Seraphine said. The trial by truth reading. Nia took one step toward her and stopped, her hands open at her sides as though she wanted to touch her daughter and could not remember how. "Seraphine," she said, and her voice broke on the name. "They will choose the charter. They will choose the sealed document you must read aloud before the full court, while the compulsion toxin eats your veins. They will pick something you cannot finish. They will pick something that kills you before the last word." "I know," Seraphine said. "I am going to do it anyway." Nia closed her eyes. Seraphine reached up and took her mother's wrist. It was thinner than she expected. "Mother," she said, "you spent my whole life trying to keep me unread. I am done being unread. Go and tell the council." Nia's mouth moved without sound for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small, terrible nod. "I will tell them," she said. "And Seraphine," she said, at the door. "Yes?" "The charter they will choose. You need to know." "Tell me," Seraphine said. "It is the charter that condemned your grandmother," Nia said. "Our line, the silencing. It has been sealed for 112 years, and it was written to kill any Vale who tried to read it. You will be the first since her to try." "I will finish it," Seraphine said. Nia looked at her for a long moment and did not say goodbye. She went out. The door was not locked behind her, which was its own kind of message. The council convened again before dawn, and the cathedral was colder this time, colder than the stone alone could account for, as though the court itself had exhaled and held its breath. Seraphine was escorted by 2 guards in antler-crested helms and by Blanche, who had wept once in the corridor and then decided not to weep again. Lord Corvain presided. The Lady Alicia had changed into a gown of winter silver. The elegant counselor in dove gray sat at Corvain's right hand and did not look at Seraphine once, which was how she knew to be afraid of him. Roran Strike was on the dais, and Roran Strike was not the same man who had severed her the night before. His gray furs were gone. He was in plain black leathers, with the bone diadem set aside on a small stone plinth, as though he had decided to meet what was coming without ornament. The lake behind his eyes had not refrozen. His jaw was a clenched line. His hands were loose at his sides, and Saraphene, who had been raised by a cartographer to notice the small tells of terrain, saw that his knuckles were white. He had not slept. The pull under her sternum tightened when she entered the chamber, and she felt rather than saw the answering hitch in his breath. The council rose. The clarion was brought forward, a cold brass instrument the length of a forearm, with a gap at its center where a document could be threaded. Corvain read the findings. The village of Orwell's Hollow, he said, registered in the 23rd year of the current reign by the clerk Harrow Vale, was not authorized for inclusion in the tribute rolls, said clerk having been posthumously found to have exceeded his commission. Harrow Vale, Saraphene thought. Her father's brother. Her uncle, dead 9 winters. The council is a creative machine, she thought, when it wants to be. The citizenship of the woman known as Saraphene Vale, Corvain continued, is therefore retroactively annulled. She holds no standing in this court. She holds no claim. She is remanded to the custody of the border marshals for safe return to her village of origin. He paused. He looked at her almost kindly. Unless, he said, she wishes to invoke a further right. Saraphene stepped forward into the chalk ring the guards had drawn in the center of the floor. She did not look at Roran, though she felt his gaze like heat along her left cheek. I invoke trial by truth reading, she said. The chamber did not gasp, which told her they had expected her to. Very well, Corvain said. His voice had the soft satisfaction of a man whose trap had sprung as designed. You will be bound in the clarion's ring. You will be given a dose of compulsion draft. You will read aloud, unbroken and unassisted, the sealed charter the council presents, and you will render its true meaning. If you falter, if you lie, if you fail to finish before the draft completes its course, you are adjudged false, and the sentence is death by the draft's own action. Do you consent? I consent, Saraphene said. The charter was brought forward by a page so pale he looked carved from chalk. It was older than any document she had ever seen. The wax was black. The seal was the antler and moon of the strike house, and over it, in a second impression that made her stomach turn, was the crossed quill sigil of the Vale line, a sigil she had never seen stamped, but had dreamed of since she was a child. The charter was threaded into the clarion. The clarion was locked. The draft was brought in a shallow copper cup. Saraphene drank it. It tasted of rust and lavender, and something that burned all the way down. The room tilted once, then steadied. The letters on the charter lifted off the page for her eyes alone, which meant the gift was waking, which meant she was committed. She bent her head to the parchment and began to read. Be it known, she said, in the 9th winter of the reign of the stag-crowned king Aldrich Strike, that the line called Vale, which has until this hour been permitted the keeping of records and the transcription of treaties, is hereby found to carry a corruption of blood. And she felt the toxin move in her veins like a second writer, trying to close her throat on the word corruption. She did not let it. She read on. The corruption, she said, is named in the old tongue as carta videns, the reading of written truth. And it is found to be incompatible with the governance of a court that must, for its survival, be permitted certain useful untruths. Rohrenstreich made a sound on the dais that was not a word. Saraphene did not look up. Therefore, she read, the Vale line is condemned to silence. Their records shall be burned. Their tongues shall be stilled by a draught of the same compulsion now administered, in measured doses, at each generation until the gift sleeps. Any Vale who breaks the silence by reading this charter aloud shall, upon completion, fall. Her knees nearly buckled. The draught was thickening in her throat. She could feel the fibers of her neck tightening like ropes. She did not stop. Any Vale, she read, and her voice was harder now, carved out of the same stone as the cathedral, who breaks the silence by reading this charter aloud shall, upon completion, fall. The chamber was utterly still. Lord Corvain's face had gone gray. The counselor in dove gray smiled, and Saraphene saw it from the corner of her eye, and she understood in that moment, with the cold, exact certainty of a cartographer reading a river, that he was the one who had handed this charter to the page. Not Corvain, him. The elegant man in dove gray was the architect. Corvain was a tall old door he stood behind. She did not stop reading. Shall fall, she read again, because the charter itself repeated the word, because the charter was not only a sentence of death, but a spell of it, written in the knowing old way, and she felt the compulsion toxin surge up as though it had been waiting for the repetition to feast on. And then, because she had spent 4 nights in a dust-choked archive and had learned more than the council suspected, she read the next line, which the council had apparently not read in 112 years, because they had sealed it before the ink was dry and trusted the seal to be enough. And any Vale who reads this charter aloud and does not fall, she read, and her voice rang now, rang off the stone, shall be held by ancient law to have proven the charter false. For the charter itself binds only the corrupt, and a Vale who survives its reading is by definition uncorrupted, and therefore the silencing is lifted, the burnings are annulled, and the line is restored in full standing with all lands, offices, and claims returned as of the date of original condemnation. A ripple went through the council, like wind through wheat. Corvain lurched half upright. The man in dove gray for the first time looked at her. His eyes were the color of old wet stone. Saraphene felt the toxin reach her heart. She felt it slow her pulse. She felt it try very hard to make her fall. She thought of Blanche by the wall, of Nia somewhere she could not see, of Orwell's Hollow, of the cartographer's passes and the silver vein calls and the long meadow where her father had taught her to walk a straight line by the North Star. She thought, absurdly, of the sparrows in the rafters. She did not fall. Her voice was the only sound in the chamber, and by the self-same clause, she read, as her vision narrowed and the letters swam and righted themselves for her one more time, the Alpha King of the Stag Court in whose reign this condemnation is overturned shall make restitution to the restored line by a binding of equal standing, such binding to be entered by mutual recognition and no other coercion, and no counsel shall interfere. The silence that followed was not the silence of a stunned court. It was the silence of a court that had been caught. The clarion's brass clicked, releasing the charter. Saraphene swayed. Rohrenstreich came down from the dais without hurry and without permission. He crossed the chalk ring. He did not touch her, though his hand hovered at her elbow like a question. "Finish," he said, low, only for her. "I am with you." His voice was a rough, controlled thing, and yet the way he said finish was almost a vow. She turned the last corner of the parchment. The final clause was handwritten, small, added in a different ink, in a hand she knew from the margins of 100 old maps her father had taught her to read. It was her grandmother's hand. Her grandmother had known, even as the charter was being drawn, that one day a veil might get this far. The clause said, "For my children's children, when you come to this line, know that the letters are alive and they have remembered you." Seraphine read it aloud. Her voice broke on it. She read it aloud anyway. And at the reading of that final line, the wax on the seal cracked audibly. The veil quill sigil split in two, and the compulsion toxin in her veins went cold, then neutral, then still. She was breathing. She was not falling. She lifted her head. The council chamber stared at her. Roarenstrike's hand was, at last, at her elbow, steadying her without claiming her, and his eyes were no longer a frozen lake. They were open water. "Lord Corvain," she said, and her voice was thin but clear. "By the charter's own terms, the silencing is lifted. My line is restored. My citizenship is not retroactively annullable, because it is not a provisional citizenship. It is an ancestral one, restored as of the date of original condemnation, which predates any clerk's commission. The tribute stands. The clause stands. The borderlands are mine." Corvain did not answer. He had sunk back into his chair like a man whose chair had become heavier. The Lady Alicia was weeping now, but not in the decorative way. The man in dove gray was smiling, and the smile did not fit anywhere on his face. He rose. He bowed very neatly to Seraphine, and she felt the bow the way one feels a knife drawn across the inside of one's wrist, carefully and without cutting yet. "My Lady Vale," he said, "my name is Counselor Harrow. No relation, I assure you, to your uncle." "A pleasure." And she knew then that her trouble had only changed shape. They gave her rooms now rather than a guest chamber, a suite in the eastern wing with 3 windows and a door that locked only from the inside. The bond she had refused to name pulled at her steadily, a low hum beneath her sternum whenever Roran passed in the corridor 3 floors below, whenever his voice rose in some distant room, whenever he sighed in sleep 2 wings away. She did not go to him. He did not come to her. They were each of them, for 3 days, very busy pretending that survival and sentiment were separate projects. Blanche brought her meals. Blanche brought her news. Corvain had retired from active counsel, pleading age. The Lady Alicia had been seen weeping in the gardens with Counselor Harrow at her elbow, and Blanche, who had a servant's ear for such things, reported that Harrow's hand on Alicia's arm had been less comforting than directing. A small girl of perhaps 7 winters had been found crying in the yew maze, a scullery child named Mira, whose mother worked in the kitchens, and Seraphine, walking the gardens on the 3rd afternoon to clear her head of bonded hums, had knelt in the gravel path and dried the girl's face with the hem of her sleeve. "Lost your way?" she said. The girl nodded and sniffled, and then, with the unhesitating judgment of the very young, climbed into Seraphine's lap as though the question had been settled. "What were you looking for?" Seraphine asked. "The white stag," the child said. "Blanche says he comes out at dusk by the second fountain." Seraphine did not know whether to laugh or cry. "Let us go and see," she said. They went. No white stag came. What came instead, from the shadow of the yew, was Roran Strike himself, on foot, in the plain black leathers he wore now when he wished not to be the king, and the child Mira looked up, saw him, and did not flinch. She slid off Seraphine's lap, walked the 4 steps to him, and put her small, sticky hand into his. Roran's breath caught. Seraphine watched his face do something she had not seen it do before, which was fold, the way a stone folds when water has been working at it for a long time. He went down slowly on one knee in the gravel, a king in an empty garden, and let the child examine the bone signet on his thumb with the gravity of a jeweler. "You are very tall," the child informed him. "I have been told," he said. His voice was rough. "Are you a king?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Are you a stag?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Can I see?" she asked. Seraphine laughed before she could stop herself, and Roran looked up at her over the child's head, and something in his face unfolded further, and she saw at last the boy he had been before the diadem. "Not today, little one," he said to the child. "Today I am only a man." The child accepted this with dignity and wandered off to stalk a sparrow. Roran rose slowly. He did not quite look at Seraphine. "Lady Vale," he said. "Your Majesty," she said. He laughed once, a short, unpracticed sound. "Do not call me that here," he said. "Here I am a man who has been a poor host and a worse executioner. I would prefer another name for the hour." She tilted her head. "What do your friends call you?" she said. He looked at her then, and the open water in his eyes went deeper. "I have not had many," he said. "Test one," she said. "Roran," he said, after a long moment. "Roran," she said, and felt the hum in her sternum strike a sweeter note at the sound of her own voice on his name, and saw, by the brief flaring of his pupils, that he had felt it too. The stag in him, she thought, the stag knows. They walked. The garden was long and cold and had no witnesses but the sparrow, who was still being stalked. He told her, in fragments, what he had not been able to tell her in a chamber full of counselors, that his court had, for 3 generations, been trading fated mates for political peace, because the antlered line was dying, because fewer and fewer stag children were born each winter, because the last thing a dying people could afford was a king too distracted by a bond to make the calculations that kept the kingdom fed. That he had known, the moment she crossed the threshold at the Frost Cathedral, what she was to him, and had spoken the severance faster because he had been trained from a boy to recognize that feeling and cut it at the root. That his mother, the previous queen, had died of a bond severed in that same cathedral 30 years ago, and he had watched. That he had been told, when he took the diadem, that the kindest thing a stag king could do for a fated mate was to release her before he knew her name. That her laugh, he said, had undone him, not the claws, the laugh. She walked beside him and did not speak for a while. Then she said, "Roran, I am going to do something that will make the council try to kill me again." He looked at her. "Tell me," he said. "I am going to take back the border valleys in my own name and run them," she said, "not as your queen, as their lady. I am going to open the archive to any Vale descendant who wants to read in it. I am going to invite the 7 forgotten brides out of the convent. Some of them, I think, will not be dead. I am going to make this court very uncomfortable." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The council will kill you before the snow." "I know," she said. They reached the second fountain. The water was frozen. He turned to face her and did not touch her. "I would like," he said, "to make that harder for them." "Would you?" "Yes," she said. He nodded once, like a man accepting a weight. Then he said, "Let us be clear about something, Seraphine Vale. I am not asking you to accept the bond as a shield. I am not asking you to accept it as a treaty. I am asking you, if you are willing, to let me court you as a man courts a woman, without crown, without counsel, without clause, at your pace. Refuse me," he said, "and I will still defend those valleys. Accept me, and you will not have to ask me twice for anything." The hum in her sternum had become a song. She looked at him. "Roran," she said. "Yes. I accept the courting. I do not accept the shielding." He almost smiled. "I had a feeling," he said. A horn sounded then, sudden and brazen from the keep, the 3-note call that meant the council had convened out of cycle, and the tender air between them went cold. He looked at her, and his jaw set. "We are summoned," he said. "I will go first. Follow when the corridor is clear." She nodded. He hesitated, then lifted her hand very slowly, gave her every chance to pull away, and pressed his mouth to the back of her knuckles. It was not a kiss in the court sense. It was a vow the size of a breath. He was gone before she could steady herself. The council had summoned them because a courier had arrived from the border with a sealed report that the Silver Vein coals had been raided in the night, and 9 miners were dead. Counselor Harrow, in his dove gray, read the report aloud with great sorrow. The raiders, he said, were unidentifiable, but the pattern of the strike matched the bandits who had plagued the border for 40 winters. It was a tragedy. It was, he implied with the most delicate emphasis, also the predictable consequence of handing disputed lands to a young woman with no militia of her own. Perhaps, he said, Lady Vale would consider releasing the claim to the crown for safekeeping until peace was restored. He smiled at her, small and pleasant. Seraphine smiled back. "Counselor Harrow," she said, "I would like to see the report." He handed it over with the air of a man who had nothing to hide. The letters lifted for her. She read the true shape of the hand beneath the courier's forgery. She read the ink. She read the pen pressure. She read the phrase, "stricken at night," where it should have read, "stricken before dawn," and knew that a man who had written such a report from the border would know the difference between those hours because he would have ridden through them. She folded the report. "Counselor Harrow," she said, "this report was written in this keep within the last 6 hours by a man who has not seen a Silver Vein call in his life." The chamber went very still. Harrow's face did not move. "That is a grave accusation, Lady Vale," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I can prove it." She laid the report on the table. She named the 3 errors of terrain. She named the scribe's hand by its slant, which she had seen once, 2 days ago, on a ledger in Harrow's own outer office. She described the ink, which came from a particular cedar gall that was used only in the keep's northern scriptorium, which Harrow oversaw. She did not accuse him. She did not have to. The council, who had watched her read a sealed charter and survive, watched her read an unsealed report and did not doubt her. Lord Corvain, from his retirement chair at the back, closed his eyes. Roran Strike, who had said nothing, looked at Harrow, and his eyes were no longer open water. They were the lake again, and something deep in it was rising. "Counselor Harrow," Roran said, very softly, "you will remain in this room." Harrow smiled, apologized for the misunderstanding with the grace of a man who had already lost and was simply choosing his exit, and excused himself to fetch the original draft from his office so that the matter could be cleared up. He walked to the door. The guards, who had not yet been instructed, let him pass. Saraphene felt the pull under her sternum tighten into alarm, and she turned to Roran and opened her mouth to say, "He will run." And then the door on the far side of the chamber slammed open, and Counselor Harrow was standing there with an instrument Saraphene had never seen before. A slim tube of pale metal, the color of bone bleached too long in the sun, and he lifted it and pointed it at her, and she understood that it was the rare metal that wounded shifter kind, turned into a weapon, and that the dart at its tip was not meant for Roran. The council shouted. Blanche, who had been at the back with a pitcher of water, dropped it. The Lady Alicia, to her eternal credit, screamed. Saraphene saw, with the slow, clear vision of a woman whose blood had been recently poisoned and cleared, the trajectory of the dart. She did not have time to move. Roran did. He was between her and the dart before her own breath finished, and the pale metal struck him in the shoulder, not the chest, because he had angled his body, and he made a sound that was not human, and also not entirely stag. A low, guttural thing that split the air, and he went down on one knee with his hand over the wound and his eyes fixed on Harrow, and the pull under Saraphene's sternum became a howl. Harrow dropped the tube. He was already running. The guards, finally instructed by nothing more than the king's kneeling silhouette, gave chase. Saraphene was on the floor beside Roran. His shoulder was bleeding black. The metal had gray veins running through it that were, as she watched, spreading along his collarbone under the skin. "No," she said. "Roran, stay!" He looked at her. "I am here," he said, but his voice was thinner than it had been. "Fated," he said quietly, as though confessing. "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I knew in the Frost Cathedral. I laughed because, if I had wept, you would have had me sent to the convent before the bond could finish waking." He closed his eyes. "Cartographer," he said, and it was almost a smile. "I mapped you," she said. "Hold on." "Blanche," she said, without looking up. "Get the archivist! Now!" Blanche was already running. The gray veins under Roran's skin had reached the hollow of his throat. The council was in chaos. Saraphene pressed both her hands over the wound and did what she had never done deliberately before, which was to let the gift open. The letters on her skin, the tattoo-like script that had waited under her pulse her whole life, lifted. They rose along her forearms in faint silver lines, the shapes of words she did not yet know how to read in herself, and they poured out of her palms into him. It was not healing. She was not a healer. It was something older. It was the reading of a body as a text, and the recognition that the metal in him was a forged line, a lie in the sentence of his flesh, and the gift of the veil was the unmaking of forgery. She read the metal out of him. It took 3 minutes. It cost her every reserve she had. The gray veins pulled back toward the wound. The wound blackened, then sluiced out a thin wash of corrupted fluid onto the stone. The pale metal sliver rose out of his shoulder on its own and lay on his chest like a spent tooth. Roran gasped. He breathed. He breathed again. Seraphine swayed, and the world went briefly white, and she felt his arms, shaky but certain, catch her before she hit the floor. "Easy," he said, into her hair. "Easy, cartographer. I have you." Somewhere very far away, Blanche was saying Harrow had reached the stables. Seraphine, with her face pressed against the unwounded side of Roran's neck, whispered, "He won't leave the grounds." The bond, yes, but also the gift had left her strange certainty about maps. "The north wall," she said, "the ice on the pond. He will try to cross it." "He has not," she said, "read the terrain." Roran laughed once, roughly, and it was a shaken sound, and he held her, and the council, for once, did not interrupt. Harrow reached the pond. The ice, as Seraphine had read from the report's description of the northern scriptorium's view, had thinned in the last 2 days under an unseasonable warm wind. He was a counselor, not a tracker, and he was running, and he was panicking, and he stepped onto the ice at the narrowest curve where the spring beneath ran closest to the surface. The ice held him for 8 steps. On the 9th, it opened. He went under. He came up once, clawing, and the guards who had followed him saw that his coat was tangled with something long and pale, which they later identified as a bundle of pale metal darts he had been carrying in the hidden lining, each of them wrapped in oiled cloth so that the compulsion draught they were steeped in would not touch his skin. The draught touched his skin in the water. He went under a second time. He did not come up a third. The pond held him for the rest of the winter, and when the thaw came and they brought him up, his face was the gray of old stone, and his hand was curled around the last unspent dart, which had pierced his own palm as he struggled. The court decided, after brief debate, that poetic justice was as valid a verdict as legal justice, and the matter was closed. The Lady Alicia was exiled to her family's northern estate, stripped of court rights for her part in Harrow's schemes, which, as it transpired, had been the part of a pawn convinced she was a queen. And she went quietly, and Seraphine, to the shock of the council, signed the exile order herself, with a note that Alicia was to be provided with an annual stipend and the right to appeal for return after 10 years. "Mercy," Seraphine wrote in the margin of the order, "is not the same as forgetting." Roran, reading over her shoulder, kissed the top of her head. "Cartographer," he said, "you make very strange maps." "I make honest ones," she said. The interrupted, almost kiss they had nearly shared in the garden after the child Mira had wandered off finally completed itself 3 nights after the pond claimed Harrow, in her eastern suite by the fire, with the door locked from the inside. It had been interrupted once before, the day she took possession of the border valleys, by a rider from the convent bringing news that 2 of the 7 forgotten brides were indeed alive and wished to come home, and she had leapt up to answer the letter, and Roran had laughed and said later, "Cartographer, later," and she had kissed him briefly on the jaw and run to her desk. Later had become that night. He had come at her invitation and not before. He had stood in the doorway until she had crossed the room and taken his hand and led him to the hearth. He had cupped her face with hands that had killed men and not once bruised her. "I will not ask again after tonight," he said, "if you do not wish me to." "I wish you to," she said. "May I mark you?" he said low, later, when the firelight had moved across them and the world had narrowed to 2 heartbeats. "Not yet," she said. She felt him smile against her throat. "When?" he said. "When I have taken possession of the valleys in full," she said, and opened the archive and brought home the brides, and when I am certain that the mark is mine to give and not my fears to give. He laughed, a ragged, low sound, and kissed the place where the mark would one day be without breaking the skin. As you say, cartographer, at your pace. The claiming came in the spring, by her choice, in the long meadow at Orwell's Hollow, where her father had taught her to walk a straight line by the North Star. It was not done in the frost cathedral. It was done under a sky the color of washed linen, with Blanche and Naya and the child Mira and an old gray mare who had decided to attend, all present, and with the 2 returned brides standing among the witnesses in their new, plain dresses. Roran knelt in the grass and spoke the short, absolute vow of his kind, which was only 6 words long and had not been spoken truly in 3 generations. And Saraphene knelt in the grass and spoke the 6 words of the veil line, which had not been legally permitted to be spoken for 112 years. And when she bared her shoulder, he set his mouth to it with a tenderness that felt to her like being read by someone who understood every word. The bond finished. The hum in her sternum became a chord. They rose together. The child Mira clapped, delighted. The gray mare, unimpressed, went on eating. By the following winter, Seraphine had opened the Veil archive to any descendant who wished to read. 3 more of the forgotten brides had come home, and 2 of them had chosen to stay in the capital as scribes in the new archive. The border valleys produced a harvest that fed 3 villages. Roran, to the scandal of his counsel and the delight of the child Mira, had been seen twice on the garden path with small scullery children on his shoulders. He had shifted once, fully, at the turn of the year, as stag kings were supposed to do, and Seraphine had walked with him through the snow with her hand on the warm velvet of his flank, and had laughed aloud at the absurd dignity of him. The pull under her sternum no longer tightened in alarm at his absences. It only glowed, quiet and constant, a thread held between them at whatever distance. On a morning in early spring, 1 year after the claiming, Seraphine sat at the breakfast table in the eastern suite with a map of the silver vein coals unrolled across the bread, and Roran came in with 2 cups of something hot and set one by her elbow and kissed the top of her head as he had the night she signed Alicia's exile. "Cartographer," he said. "Yes," she said. "You have been rereading that map for a week," he said. "I have," she said. "What does it say?" he said. She did not look up. "It says," she said, "that I am going to have to redraw the northern border in the autumn because there is going to be a 3rd party to consider by then." He went very still. She felt him go still. She allowed herself at last to lift her eyes. His face had folded again, the way it had folded in the gravel path when a small child had put her hand in his. He sat down slowly on the bench beside her. "Seraphine," he said. "Yes," she said. "A 3rd party," he said. "A small one," she said. "Small at first," she amended, "getting larger." He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he took her hand and pressed it to his mouth, and she felt his breath shake. And she laughed, a soft laugh this time, nothing like the laugh she had given in the Frost Cathedral. And he laughed too, and the stag in him, somewhere deep behind his eyes, made a contented huffing sound that was not meant for human ears, but which, through the bond, she heard anyway. It said, in the blunt, affectionate way of inner creatures, "Ours." Later that morning, she walked in the garden with the child Mira, who was 8 now and less inclined to sit in laps, and told her the news. And Mira, after a moment's dignified consideration, said, Will it be a stag or a cartographer? And Seraphine, laughing, said, I think we shall have to wait and see. And Mira, satisfied, went off to stalk a sparrow. Somewhere above them, a pair of sparrows in the clear story of a distant frost cathedral were building a nest in the antler chandeliers that no one had thought to dust since a certain laugh had startled their ancestors out of it. And if you are still listening, dear traveler, to the tale of the cartographer's bastard who laughed at an alpha king, I would be very grateful if you would tell me what you thought on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments below. And if this story warmed you even a little, consider subscribing to the channel so the next tale can find you when the frost comes again.